Okay. All right, let's get started. So we were learning yesterday about, we're continuing along in this discussion of Tsar Bali Chaim, and we're in the Imrei Yaakov. The Rav Shulchan Aruch had said that im tzrichim lahem l'refua, if infliction of pain upon an animal is necessary in order to acquire a medicinal cure, o l'sha'ar dvarim shehem l'tzarech ha'adam, or for any other utility that is for man's needs, ein bo mishum tsar bali chaim. There is no prohibition of tsar bali chaim. And it's on that basis, he says, v'lachein muter limrot notzos me'avozos chayos im ein lo notza acheres. He says it is therefore permissible to pluck feathers from geese if there are no other feathers available. Rak shaha'olam nimno'im mishum achzarius. But Jews tend to avoid doing this because it breeds cruelty. Because, obviously it's painful for the bird. So this whole idea of im tzrichim lahem l'refua, it certainly shows in Jewish law how there is an imperative to the preservation of human life over animal life. There's no question about it. So PETA activists are not in concert with the Torah's view on the prioritization of species. The human species is the highest, and therefore, and God gave the animal kingdom to human beings to help improve the human condition. And as such, if there is a cure that can be found for diabetes or cancer or anything like that, and we need to inflict pain upon animals in order to do that, obviously you have to minimize the pain. But if there is laboratory mice and guinea pigs and things like that, is certainly justifiable according to the laws of Tsar Bali Chaim. Now, as far as sha'ar devarim that are for the human needs, other things that are for human utility. So the Imrei Yaakov says as follows. He says, Yesh omrim the davka shuhu litzorech tashmisha adam. He says, some say that this is only true if it provides human utility. Avolom mishum kol revach yesh lahatir. But not if it's going to earn you money. And so it's not really clear what he's referring to. In other words, let's say I can make more money by inflicting pain upon animals, but the infliction of pain does not provide a direct benefit or utility. It just provides me more money. So then that's not going to be permitted. He says, "V'gam yesh lechalik ben godel hatzar v'tzarechiyim." And we also have to distinguish between the degree of pain that the animal is experiencing. And he says, "Va'ayin b'shut minchas Yitzchak, the pasak le'inyan lahariv tarnagolos mispar yamim kedei sheyigram sheyatilu achar kach beitzim umasik demedina leka b'zeh yisurei." He says, I refer you to the a responsum in the Sefer Minchas Yitzchak, which we have here. The Minchas Yitzchak was Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss. He was a posek of the 20th century. And he passed away in 1989, and he was a posek in Eretz Yisrael. And the issue that he's dealing with is the case of where a farmer is writing to find out, I would like to starve my chickens for a certain number of days, because by starving the chickens and then feeding them, it causes them to start laying eggs. And he says that Rav Weiss paskind that it is possible to permit such a thing, but at the same time, he would advocate to avoid it whenever possible. So I have the tshuva over here. Let me just So the tshuva appears over here. What is the question that is being presented? Be'inyan sar balei chayim. This is a tshuva from Tufshin Lamed Beis, 1972, and he says, I've been asked this question from a number of rabbanim. Al derech megadle tarnagolos lebeitzim shahayu regilim liknos pargiot benot shlosha chadashim. He says what they used to do is they would buy young birds that are 3 months old. Hechaziko otan belul ad gil esrim chodesh. They keep them in a chicken coop until they reach the age of 20 months. Shehuzman hatalasan hamakubal, and that's when chickens typically start laying eggs. Uvechodesh chaf alef lechayehen machru etz hazekenos lebasar, and in the 21st month, they sell the old chickens for their meat. In other words, I guess for the slaughter. Meshech osa tekufa nehnu mehatalas beitzim yudbeis ad tesvav chodesh. But the egg laying is from 12 months to 15 months. So, in other words, they would keep these chickens for a period of, they would buy them at 3 months old, they would keep them until they're 20 months old, and between the ages of 12 months to 15 months old is when they're at their peak of egg laying. Ke'is konim pargios ba'oso gil, u'mash'irin osan l'tekufas hatola ad l'chodesh tesvav l'chayehen, and zman hatolasan b'tekufa hi asara chadashim, u'la'achar mikein ma'avir misatarnagolas l'shisha shavuos ad l'chodshayim l'tekufa shel neshiras notzos. Okay, there's a lot of detail here which doesn't really add up. It's not very clear how he's presenting it. But he's saying that there's a certain period, ba'oso zman, einos lehem mazon asar yamim rak mayim l'shtiya lelo hagbala. And he says that there's a period of time when the chickens molt their feathers, and during that time, they don't give them food for a period of 10 days. All they give them is water. And al yedei haneshira hin mischajos lahatolas beitzim mechadash echel me'achodesh hayud ches l'chayein. And it's at that point, once they molt their feathers, they become rejuvenated in their egg-laying capability in their 18th month for a period of 10 months. V'rak b'chodesh chav ches l'chayein mochen osam labasar. And by doing this process of starving them for 10 days, instead of having to sell them when they're 21 months old because they've already passed their age of egg laying, you can extend their egg laying days until they're 28 months old. Kach ma'arichim es ha'tekufa satolas b'chamisha chadashim lepachos v'im ki'in kan revach shel 25% b'glal ha'otzos ha'hazana ha'tipul. He says there's clearly a profit involved, but it involves starving the chickens for 10 days at a certain point of their gestation when they're molting their feathers, and this will extend their egg-laying productivity for an additional at least 5 months. So that's the question. Can you justify starving these birds for a period of 10 days, which is very obviously difficult for them to have to endure in order to increase their productivity of egg laying? Okay, that's essentially the question. Rav Weiss deliberates over this, and his conclusion is that as long as you're being passive in depriving an animal of nutrition, then you can justify it. And then, after saying that it is justifiable, he says, V'hinei, he'ir tzad safek mihadim mechuyavim lahachil behema lifnei sheyochal. But he says, but what about the halacha that is brought by the Gemara, and that many of us know, that a person has to feed his animal before he himself eats? It's an obligation in the Gemara. So how can you tell me that starving an animal is justifiable? So, and he brings then, this paragraph over here from the Sefer HaCharedim, which is a medieval Sefer. He says, Matzanu Godel Ha'inyan Sheyesh Bahanal. We know that there's a great importance that is placed upon feeding your animals before you yourself eat. Umitzad hasheni matzanu sham kula benogea linidon didan v'zelu shano sham. So the Sefer Charedim brings first the Gemara. Amar Rav Yehuda asur la'adam sheyitom klum kodem sheyitin ma'achal behemto. The Gemara says that it is forbidden for a person to eat anything before he first feeds his animals. Shenemar v'nosati esav b'sadach alivhemtecha v'hadar v'achalta v'savata. We actually saw this pasuk referenced before. We know this from the Kriya Shema. It says, the sequence of the pasuk is, I shall give grass in the field for your animals. And then the pasuk says, and you shall eat and be sated. So we see from here that this is the source in the Torah for the prohibition of Tsar Balei Chayim. That the Torah requires me to make sure that my animal is fed before me, which it teaches me, I can infer from here, that I'm not allowed to inflict pain upon an animal. He says, the kol shekain sha'asur litzar kol balei chayim biyadayim. It is certainly, from there we can infer that it is prohibited to inflict pain on an animal actively. Uchenamrina b'kama duch litzar balei chayim da omrim haviyuha poskim. And then he brings a story. He says, Umaysa haya b'dorenu sheharav hamekubal hagadol kemo harenu Yitzchak Ashkenazi zal shenistakel b'fnei talmid chacham echad. He says there was once a mekubal, a Kabbalist, named Rabbi Yitzchak Ashkenazi, who looked into the face of a certain scholar. Va'amar lo nirsham b'fanecha avon tsar balei chayim. And by looking in his face, he told him, there is something on your face that has imprinted on your face that you are guilty of the sin of inflicting pain to animals. And the scholar was very bothered by this. He didn't know what he had done wrong. He discovered that his wife had not properly fed the chickens in the morning, but rather she just let the chickens roam freely and peck for themselves to find food for themselves. And so this was the Tsar Balei Chayim that he was guilty of. And so he told his wife, no, that's unacceptable. You need to take bran from the grain, which was usually meant for animal feed. Today we use bran. It's like, for us it's a machaya, right? But back in the day, they didn't use bran for any purpose. So he said you have to mix it with water, put it in front of the chickens every morning. So once this scholar fixed the problem, the great Mekubal didn't know about it, but he looked in his face and he said, whatever you did in the past that was wrong has been rectified. Mahaya hadavar, and so the Kabbalist asked him, what actually happened? Azhigi lo ha'inyan, and then the scholar told him what had happened and how he had fixed it. V'nira shezeh anaf mimitzvat v'halachta bidrachav. So you see from this, that says the Charedim, that the mitzvah of Tsar Balei Chayim is actually an offshoot of the commandment in general of you shall walk in God's ways. Upirshu mahu rachum afatorachum, and as the rabbis explain, that just like God is merciful, so shall you be merciful, and so. And it says about God that His mercy is upon all of His creations. And so Rav Weiss, that's the quote from Sefer HaCharedim, and Rav Weiss says, Chazinan mehanal ad kama hadvarim migim shetzrichem lihizar bazeh. So first of all, you see how careful you have to be about this mitzvah. He says, Ulaumas zerayin and disvirle degam din hanal habimidin tsar balei chayim. But he also, we can also see from here that even passively, not feeding your animals is a violation of Tsar Balei Chaim. He says, but at the same time, Im Kain Litzorech, the Leka Mishum Tsar Balei Chaim, Gameha Dina Lesa. He says, but if there was a need that you could justify, so that you could say that this provides a human utility, that we are able to get more productivity out of the animals, you could justify it, especially because you're doing something passive. He says, the ein monin rak achila le'ize yamim, you're only withdrawing feed for a certain limited number of days. Umishum tachlis shel chayim v'lo misa kamo bekipa ve'efshar dein tsar gadol kol kach af ba'os zman kinizkar. He says, you're not actually starving the animals to the point of death. You're not causing them to become sickly, and perhaps the pain that you're exposing them to is not a huge amount of pain, and therefore we can justify it. But then he says at the end, he says, "V'kol ze me'ikra dedina." He says, but everything that we've said is me'ikr hadin, according to the letter of the law. Aval adayin yesh bazeh inyan musari. But there's also a musar aspect, which means there's an ethical aspect that a person has to take to heart. Sheharei chazinan kama kaptu razal be'inyan sar balei chayim kimavor harbe b'sefer chasidim ayin sham. As we see, the Sefer Chasidim, an even earlier source, was very exhortative about this mitzvah. After benogeya im yesh tzarech adam hekil sham le'inyan bal tashchis kimavor sham. He says, granted that when there's a human utility, there is a leniency that you're even allowed to destroy animals. V'huva b'shvus Yaakov sham v'yesh lomar duhu adin le'inyan sar balei chaim demedama shvus Yaakov lahadadi mikol makom kasafti leha'ir. He says, yes, it's true that we can justify tsar balei chaim when there's a human utility, but you should keep this, you should bear this in mind. So it's the same idea. The idea being that you can justify when there's human utility and human benefit, you can justify tsar balei chaim, but you also have to be careful about it. And if there's an alternative, as far as, let's say, here's the dilemma today, right? The dilemma today is that we have this thing called factory farming, right? And factory farming is where they've created this tremendous way of saving money by keeping birds very, very cooped up in these very, very large facilities. And they have the egg-laying system and the milking system down to a science. But it really very much curtails the quality of life of these animals. Chickens normally should be free roaming and walking around and pecking and doing all the things that chickens do. And instead they spend their entire lives in these very, very small, confined wire boxes. And it's a miserable existence. But it results in us, you and I, being able to spend $3 for a dozen eggs. And it's a machaya for us, right? So there's definitely an economic benefit to us, but it's at the expense of the pain that is caused to these animals. And it's definitely something that we in society should be very concerned about. And we should, at some point, make our feelings known that this is not something that we wish to see happen to animals. And I don't know what to do about it other than to say that this is a problem. And that's where we get into the idea of how it benefits us, but only to the point where we end up saving money. Yeah, Ron, sorry.
Would COR ever get involved with something like this? Because there's people who would probably be willing to pay a premium to, let's say, have eggs where they know those chickens wouldn't be suffering from Sar Balei Chaim or any other sort of issues. Would they get involved with that, or do you think there's a market out there for people who would pay a premium for that?
I do think that there is a market for it. I know for a fact that there's a market for it. For example, if I do a Google on let me just see here, free
Sure.
range eggs.
Chicken eggs.
Yeah. Okay, so free range chicken eggs. Uh, the choice is yours. A guide to buying eggs. Eggfarmers.ca. So, oh, this is a bunch of propaganda. Hold on a second. No, that's just a propaganda website. Okay. The
But
difference.
is there a kashrut issue? Am I correct in understanding that free range eggs are subject to having more blood spots in them?
I have never. I'm not
Yeah.
aware of that. I don't know anything
They
about that.
they candle them before they sell them.
Um, there are many poskim who say that unfertilized eggs, even with chicken, even with blood spots, is not a halachic problem. So, but we're talking about here's a Wikipedia entry on free range eggs. Free range eggs are eggs produced from birds that may be permitted outdoors. The term free range may be used differently depending on the country and the relevant laws, and is not regulated in many areas. Eggs from hens that are only indoors might also be labeled cage-free, barn roaming, or aviary, following the animal happiness certification policies, also known as happy chickens or happy eggs. This is different from birds that are reared in systems labeled as battery cages or furnished cages. Let me see if there's any system in Canada. No, there's no entry for Canada. There's the US, EU, and Australia. Okay, but there's actually probably a egg farmers. Let's see, free range eggs near me. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of places where you can buy free range eggs, but you're not going to find them in at Sobeys or at No Frills. Here, free range eggs. You can find it on Kijiji. Kijiji has a whole entry for free range eggs. All right, but anyway, very affordable. Let's see. Farm fresh brown eggs daily. We have farm fresh range, free range. We have fresh, free range brown eggs. If anyone wants them, the phone number is 416-721-4364, and they are $5 per dozen, which is actually quite reasonable when you think about it. They are free range and are fed fresh fruit and vegetables daily as well as grain. Available in packs of 12 and flats of 30. And this one's in Mississauga. There's one in Oakville. So, yes, Ron, there is a market for it. I don't know how big the market is for it, but it's not something that COR gets involved with. Most kashrus agencies do not take a position on factory farming, and because it does not affect the kashrus status, but perhaps it should. Perhaps, there have been many people over the years who have advocated for, just like you have a standard called glot kosher, right? You should have a standard that, maybe says that the animals have been treated humanely according to this standard. But we are not there. We're definitely not at that point. Free-range eggs are not necessarily the same as organic. The USDA requires that free-range eggs come from chickens that have some access to a small fenced patch of cement, which they may or may not use. Additionally, free-range chickens might eat non-organic feed and are sometimes given antibiotics or other drugs. Okay? That's from Izzy. Okay. All right. Let's do one more quick halacha.
Probably more difficult, Rabbi, with respect to free range is free range meat. Because I think from a kashrut standpoint, you're not going to get shechted free range meat. So
There
I guess
is
one can only go so far.
there was a company I know in the U.S. I don't know if it exists in Canada, but there was a company in the U.S. that was offering free range beef and free range chickens that were shechted. Yeah. Again, you're right. Your choices are limited. There's no question about it. Anyway. V'lachein muter limrot notzos. It is for this reason that it is permitted to pluck feathers from a goose, if that's the only way to get your feathers. Ken kasav betrumas hadeshen de lachtoch lashon ha'of kadeshi yedaber ve'oznayim v'zonav mikelev kedei liyafoso. He says, let's say you wish to cut the tongue of the bird so that it speaks. The Trumas Hadeshen is a Rishon, he's an early medievalist, and he writes that to cut the tongue of a bird to enable it to speak. And I'm not sure what he's referring to, maybe like a parrot, it's not clear to me. Or to clip the ears or the tail of a dog to beautify it for grooming. He says, Afal gav di mishum tsar balei chaim leka. He says you can justify or mitigate the prohibition of tsar balei chaim. Why? De ein iser mishum tsar balei chaim imu osa litzrachav. Because if you're doing it for a utility, to beautify the animal, or to get the animal to make loud noises, that's justifiable. Mikol makom ha'olam nimnoim lefishu midas achzaris. But nevertheless, Jews don't do this in general because it engenders cruelty within a person. He says, and it seems that what he's referring to is that when you pluck the feathers from the bird, from the body of the bird, avol meritas hanotzos shel ha'agafayim, but he says, but to clip the wings of an animal, of a bird, he says, in order to prevent it from flying away, that is considered to be permissible, and that is because you're not actually plucking the whole feather, you're not uprooting the whole feather from the body of the bird, but rather just clipping the wings. He says that's okay. It doesn't inflict undue pain on the animal. It's not as painful as plucking the feathers, and that's what generally people do. And it's considered to be an acceptable practice.
So, Rabbi, we're not talking about kind of emotional pain. It's strictly physical. In other words, a bird is meant to fly, so you're restricting its natural sort of aspect by forcing it not to be able to.
Yes, that's true. Although, there doesn't seem to be that kind of that's probably of a lesser nature of Tsar Balei Chaim. All we've seen until now is the I would argue that caging an animal is also a form of Tsar Balei Chaim, even though there's no physical pain.
I think this might have been Ron's point. Was it yesterday about zoos and things like that and captivity?
Yeah. Okay.
Tigers.
I want to show you something from Rav Kook tomorrow. We'll go over that. Okay, so have a good day.
Okay.
Talk to you
Take
soon.
care.